60 to 70% foreign fighters. They're not Iraqis. They're foreign fighters. From 2003 to 2011, really 2008, things after the surge dropped off dramatically. Like 95% of the violence went away. But the insurgents back then were 70% foreign fighters, and the numbers were about the same, about 15,000. Foreign fighters, they're not Iraqi citizens. So we'll talk about where those folks came from, and we'll talk about how that ties into the Arab Spring a little bit. What happened with the Arab Spring? We watched this thing happen. It's kind of a mystery, isn't it? It kind of came and went. We saw some demonstrations and some riots, and a couple of governments changed, and some didn't. And you know, it's sort of, well, what did all that evolve into? I mean, what's the end result of the Arab Spring, and how did that impact Iraq and Iraq's current situation? We can't look at Iraq's status today without looking back on the Arab Spring. And then what it has to do with Iraq. Modern-day Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq were formed post-World War I. But we're just looking at the region here and dates that their current government really emerged. Most of these post-World War I and even post-World War II, which was another wave of new countries being formed and borders being shaped, who ruled? There were no democracies there. Israel was the only one, 1948. The only democracy in the entire Middle East. So what happened is in all of these countries, from World War I and then post-World War II, there were monarchies or dictatorships. Every single country had a king or an emir, a sultan, someone, some single figurehead that ran everything. People tell me today, you know, I think those people, I think that's all they like. It's just a dictator. I think that's what they want. It's just, that's all they respond to is a dictator. For 5 generations, that's all they've had. I met a guy back in 2003 that came over and after they apprehended Saddam Hussein, he was a Department of Defense psychologist. And he was Chinese, brilliant guy, Dr. Chen. He had sat down and had dinner with him one night, and I said, well, Dr. Chen, how was your interview today with Saddam Hussein? He said, you know, Kim, he said, I've studied these guys. He said, they all have so many striking similarities. He said, 2 weeks ago, I was with Manuel Noriega in his cell down in Florida. And he said, the same traits, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, same traits, all the same drivers, Saddam Hussein. Thugs that rise to the top, just through brutality. But, I mean, brutality that's beyond our imagination. We got a little whiff of it here with these beheadings. You know, that's so appalling, we just kind of almost think, well, that can't be real. That can't really, oh, they stopped doing that back in the 1400s, didn't they? Surely that didn't happen a couple of weeks ago. Won't happen next week. I mean, it can't be. That's so inhuman. But keep in mind, all these countries had strong-arm leaders because that's really what led to the Arab Spring. I told many of my Iraqi friends in 2010, 2011, when the first few countries started demonstrating, I said, you know what? I said, I think you guys are causing this. He said, what do you mean? What do you mean, Colonel Poole? I said, it's a good thing. All the Middle East has seen 75, 77% of the population on election day holding that purple finger, that ink-stained finger, selecting your own leaders. And people have started asking themselves, why not us? I mean, we live under a dictator. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of them that unfolded here. As we go through these, I want to single out just a few of them and talk about where some of the more profound revolutions occurred. But beginning in Tunisia, of all places. And Tunisia today is still struggling, a very, very new democracy. But they had their, in January 2011, they began the revolution in December 2010. But January 2011, they ousted their dictator. The next 2 years brought a constitution and an elected government. So they're a very fledgling democracy, only a few years old. Now, Notice this time frame that I'm zeroing in on here, around 2010, 2011, 2012, was the Arab Spring. What was going on in America's view of the Middle East? Where were we? 2010, 2011, 2012. We're trying to get out of there. We got campaign promises. We got to get out of there. We gave a deadline. We published a deadline. We got to get our troops out of there on time. It's political. It's an obligation. It was a campaign promise. Egypt, January 2011, also overthrew Hosni Mubarak. Did you take notice of what happened in Egypt? The revolution was hijacked by the Islamic Brotherhood. They had an election, and all of a sudden the Islamic Brotherhood has Morsi in there. And of course the Egyptian people are, who's this guy? Where did the Islamic Brotherhood come from? And they literally hijacked the revolution. They had a second revolution and ousted Morsi and took the government back over and had a follow-up election, and now they've got their elected leaders running the country. And it's not a perfect democracy yet. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. They chased him to a ditch out in the middle of the desert, and his own people took care of him out there. Now that was one Arab Spring revolution that we did have a UN mandate to assist. We singled that one out. But what happened after the revolutionaries took over? Who stepped in? Keep in mind, after these revolutions, there is always, throughout history, where there's been a revolution, there's always a power vacuum. Always a power vacuum. I mean, how did Lenin come into power? Power vacuum. Hitler stepped into a power vacuum, actually. He started his own revolution from the inside, so to speak. But every time you've got a strong-armed person, a radical leader, it's always through hijacking the will of the people and taking it over and using brutality to hang on to it. We know the power vacuum in Libya, it was a confusing thing. The Islamic extremists are there. All of a sudden, the royal family comes back, and they're sort of, hey, you know, it's our turn. We need to go back and take, you know, it's our birthright to take back over. And no one backed anyone. So Benghazi happened. I'm trying not to be overly simplistic. I mean, you can connect all the dots, though. Believe me, they connect easily and clearly. And it will shape the conditions in the Middle East. So when we look at these way forward in just a few minutes, it's going to be pretty clear to us. You're going to see that, hey, there's some facts. Some facts. As President Reagan said, the facts are just such a nuisance, you just can't make them go away. You just can't, just ignore them and treat them like they don't exist. They're there. Who also said, by the way, was the first president that really said, we will not negotiate with terrorists. That was President Reagan. And the world followed suit. The Western world followed suit. We will not negotiate. And then the Middle East followed suit. We will not negotiate with terrorists. Now, what about it different these days? Of course, today we've got a current civil war with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. There is a legitimate, and this is not confusing. Let me just tell you, this is not confusing. There's a legitimate anti-government revolutionary group there. And they've been fighting for going on a year before ISIS showed up. And they came in and tried to hijack the revolution. We're going to fight with you. But then they wound up attacking the revolutionaries, so they wound up defending themselves, and then they turned and attacked ISIS and ran them out of the country. Where'd they go? Iraq. They moved back out into western Iraq and Al-Anbar province and Fallujah and Al-Ramadi, back in their old haunts. And the Sunni in that province were the ones that ran them out in the first place. It was not the Shia. It was the Sunni that ran them out. The tribe stood up, the sheikh stood up and ran them out. I mean, they got their weapons out. Everyone in Iraq's got a weapon. Everybody's got an AK-47. If you don't have one, they'll issue you one. Everybody's got one. So getting out in the streets and taking care of trouble is just a matter of getting the neighborhood riled up. And the sheikhs did a good job back in 2006 and 2007 doing that very thing. But we have this, to me, it's a little illogical confusion over who to support in Syria. And we know that Bashar al-Assad has brutalized his own people, has used weapons of mass destruction against his own people. And we drilled him and said, don't step over that again. And he used them a second time. And we drew another line. He said, don't, we're going to throw some sanctions at you somehow. It won't mean anything to you, but we're going to. So it continues to struggle. They've got a legitimate civil war going on. They're going to have to, the people in Egypt, in the Middle East, are going to have to figure out who they're going to support. Al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, or revolutionaries. And remember, we departed on 18 December 2011. The last troops left. I was there that day, watched them leave Baghdad, watched them drive down the road. One of the deputy commander of multinational force Iraq told me 4 or 5 days before this, about the 15th or the 12th of December, he got me aside at the embassy one day and he said, Kim, he said, because I was running all the support for the Department of State, 17 different locations, and he said, I got to tell you, he said, I can't believe you're staying here. I said, sir, I think it's going to be just fine. I said, I think these guys are going to have a tough, they're going to stumble, they're going to have some mistakes, and but they'll get it right, they'll figure it out. It took us quite a while in America. They'll figure it out. He said, Kim, you don't understand. He said, it's going to come crashing down. He said, if you want a full-up brief from my intel officer, the senior intel guy in Iraq, said, I'll have him give you a full brief because you need to know. You got almost 7,000 civilians here working for you, and you need to know. I went to the briefing, and I heard it all. One more intel briefing. And it was good. It was very insightful. But it was interesting from 18 December. Now, the week before that, I can tell you, every single day, we got 2 or 3 rockets or mortars, as we had for years, every single day. The sirens would go off. Everybody would run to a bunker. You'd be there long enough to where the all clear went up and everybody went back to work. That's every single day, 365 days a year. December the 18th, the last round was fired. December 19th until about March of this year, not one more round was fired. Not one more rocket or mortar round was fired into the international zone, which was sort of that's zero. That's the center of the bullseye. It's the center of government. But it literally just died off. Now there was still anti-Iraq forces that were still out there, a couple of thousand people that were trying to stir up problems. They also had a major jailbreak and broke out about 1,000 hard cases and got them out and turned them to. I got to tell you though, I came home in January 2012. R&R came home and had a great New Year's with Ruthie and the family, and I went back and you have to fly in through Dubai. You have to go to Dubai. You can't fly directly in Baghdad, so you have to start out in Dubai or Turkey or somewhere to get in there. So I went to Dubai, flew into Baghdad, and I get on the plane, I immediately bury into my book, and I didn't even really look up, didn't pay any attention, didn't really look to see if I knew anybody on the plane or anything, but I zipped through customs and rushed to the baggage carousel, and I'm standing there. Now this is January 2012, just a couple of weeks after this, and I'm looking around, and I realized I'm the only non-Chinese standing at this carousel. There must be 230 Chinese standing right here. So I saw one of the guys I knew in customs. I'm like, where'd all the Chinese come from? He said, oh, they're here to do business. They're here to drill for oil. They're coming. The minute the last round, when the smoke cleared and the last round was fired, the Chinese, the Russians poured in there. Poured in there. South Koreans are building hundreds of thousands of new residences. There hasn't been a new home built in 40 years, 50 years. Not one new structure built during the entire period of Saddam's his ruling. So everything is desperately antiquated. But I can tell you, everybody else is there. What is the current political situation and security situation in Iraq? Well, you've watched the most recent elections. This election was really under a great amount of threat because ISIS was really stepping up. standing up and going door to door and threatening people. And people that had, notes put on their doors before, we'll kill you if you go to vote, still had 70-75%. This election had 62%. Nur al-Maliki's party won 93 of the 328 parliament seats. And you think, well, that's about a third, so he's no majority. Keep in mind, there's 44 political parties in Iraq. 44 political parties. And his rule of law party won 1/3. So they're the vast, vast majority party. So they get to appoint the prime minister. And Nur al-Maliki had sort of manipulated things to get himself able to get a waiver out of the Constitution that was set up back in 2005 and ratified for 2 terms, very similar to the UK's and ours, and he got approval to go for a 3rd term. But he's been replaced now, as you know, by Haider al-Abadi, who is by the way, a very, very good man. Very good man. He lived in the UK, was an exile from Saddam, came back, very, very successful businessman in London, and came back into Iraq in 2004. I met him the day that he arrived, and he was in the communication ministry, and he'll make a good prime minister. He has no aspirations of being a dictator. And I think that was one of the things that Nur al-Maliki was just about to tip over the scales and decide that he had to be such a hardline ruler that he would resemble a dictator. And most of the people were afraid of that. So it's a good replacement, it's a healthy thing. But this was a very successful election, 62% turnout. The military, though, what about the security situation? Why aren't these guys whipping up on these ISIS? Why don't they? Iraq does not have an offensive force. They've been designed as a defensive force with intent. 40,000 total national police. That's every policeman nationwide in every community across the country. The country is about the size of Texas or California, roughly, about 35 million people. 271,000, a little more than that, total active military. They've got great individual equipment that they acquired from us, but they still are way short on the training. If you look at regional standards, they're very good. Very good regional standards. But keep in mind, if you remember the 100-hour ground campaign in 1991, and the fact that it took 3 weeks in 2003 to topple the government, that's the standards. Just think in terms of standards of training and capability. When Tommy Frank said he was going in to liberate Iraq with 269,000 soldiers, something like that, I thought, well, wait a minute, we had 650,000, 32-country alliance in Desert Storm. He's going in with less than half of that? You got to be kidding. And no 42-day air campaign. He's just going to drive in and slug it out. He was right. He was right. But it was the standard. They have got a good regional standard, but they do not have anything to compare to a Western standard, police or military. So they've got to come a lot farther. They've got a lot of tanks that were leftovers from Saddam's days. They've got about 80 new M1A1 tanks, not the A2s, but the M1A1s. They've got 157 transport helicopters. They've got 4, count them, 4 combat helicopters. 1 got shot down about 2 weeks ago, so they're down to 3. They do have, as you might be aware, they bought almost $8 billion worth of military purchase, foreign military sales program with the Department of Defense, and they have a squadron of F-16s about to be fielded in the northern part of Iraq, a 2nd squadron next year that's going to be in the southern part of Iraq. That will give them some of their own air capability. But it's not in that they don't have a fledgling Air Force, they don't have an Air Force. 3 attack helicopters. So when we start looking and we're thinking, well, what are they doing about this? Why aren't they going in there and taking care of this? 57 total watercraft, really river patrols, and very, very ancient boats. If you can see that picture on the top left, I've seen these boats down in Qasr. All of them are in Qasr Port, down in South Basra. But very, very antiquated. The only thing that's new and modern are these Defender-class patrol boats down here in the lower left. They're basically large Kevlar inflatable boats, fast movers that interdict on the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They also have about 257 artillery pieces, very, I mean, most of them belong in museums. They've got